Formal introduction. Welcome to Buddhism in the United States in Practice. Our guest today is Dr. Benjamin Nourse, who is an assistant professor of Buddhist Studies in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Denver. His talk will introduce some of the ways that Buddhists in the contemporary world practice their tradition. Many people today associate Buddhism mainly with meditation, but meditation is just one of the many ways that Buddhists put their traditions into practice. Dr. Nourse will share examples from Buddhist communities in the United States and Denver, highlighting practices such as religious festivals, community rituals, chanting and prayer, generosity, as well as meditation. Through these examples, we will understand the rich diversity of Buddhist traditions in the United States, while also exploring some of the glue that holds them all together as Buddhists. Please welcome Dr. Benjamin Nourse. Thank you for being here, and thank you all for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, everyone. It's good to be here. Yeah, and with today's talk, well, first of all, so I'm assistant professor of Buddhist Studies at the University of Denver. How did I get to that place? It was a long and winding road. When I went away to college at the University of Wisconsin, I was interested in studying Chinese language and literature. And as part of an Asian studies major, I took classes in a lot of the religions of Asia and became very interested in Buddhism. And my junior year, I spent a year abroad in Nepal and began studying more intensively Tibetan language and Tibetan culture. And so then after I graduated, I wanted to continue that path. So after a few years, I went back to graduate school at the University of Virginia and continued to study mainly Tibetan Buddhist traditions, but also Chinese Buddhist traditions. And now that's my focus at the University of Denver. But I also have been teaching a class for about 10 years now on Buddhism in the United States. I'm really interested in the development of the tradition in this country. And I asked this opening question, what do you think of when you think of Buddhism? And somebody answered the Far East. And I think that's a very good answer. We find Buddhism, particularly in South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia. But Buddhism is a thriving tradition here in the United States now as well. And actually, the United States is one of the most diverse Buddhist countries in the world. There's Buddhist traditions from all over Asia and all over the world that are represented in the United States and right here in Denver. And so I wanted to introduce you to some of the different kinds of Buddhism you might find just around town, and also the great diversity of the tradition, both around the world and here locally. So that's kind of my aim today. But I also want to introduce some aspects of just Buddhism more generally. And I'm sure, this is going to be a really quick dive into this really rich tradition, again, with a lot of diversity. So if at some point you have any questions, feel free to stop me, put things in the chat, or just, interrupt me and ask a question. That's fine. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. Let's see. Yeah, so Buddhism in the US in practice, the topic for today. And again, I think when people think about Buddhism, what comes to mind might be meditation or a serene monk in robes meditating. And those ideas might come from, being in the grocery store and seeing an image like this from Buddha Bowl organic popcorn, right? In kind of popular culture and popular media, the most popular representation of Buddhism is this kind of meditating monk figure or this Buddha figure. You can find them in people's gardens and home decor even, right? And so this is what a lot of people have in mind when they think Buddhist. They think they're all kind of serenely meditating somewhere. And again, with this presentation, I want to kind of challenge that and look at in addition to meditation, some of the other ways that people put this tradition into practice. In addition to meditation. So I think a good place to start when talking about Buddhism it's a really diverse tradition. It spans a lot of cultures, a lot of languages. So what holds a lot of Buddhists together? One thing is a particularly important touchstone for the tradition wherever you find it, and that's the three jewels or the three refuges. These are things that almost every Buddhist tradition will say is at the core of this religion, this tradition, and that all Buddhists can agree are very important and in fact very precious. That's why they're called the jewels. They're also called the refuges because Buddhists, the general thrust of Buddhism is that our existence, our lives are not quite as we want them to be. We always seem a little bit dissatisfied or not quite content. From a Buddhist perspective, they would say a lot of us, we're always thinking, if only this were the case, if only our situation was like this, or if only we had this, our lives would really be great. But when we get those things, there's always something else. The goalpost is always moving. And so we're always in this state of discontent or dissatisfaction. But we're always searching for peace and that deep level of contentment and satisfaction. And from the Buddhist tradition, they say the only things that ultimately are going to give us that lasting sense of peace and satisfaction are relying on these three jewels. And so they're refuges from the kind of suffering and dissatisfaction that Buddhists say is kind of inherent in life and in our existence as sentient thinking and feeling beings. So Buddhists will often, if somebody asks, what makes you a Buddhist? Many Buddhists will answer, if you've gone for refuge to these three jewels, if you've taken them as your kind of final refuge from these, this existential problem of suffering and discontent. And so here's a refuge prayer in Pali, and this would be chanted, Buddham Sharanam Gacchami, Dharmam Sharanam Gacchami, Sangham Sharanam Gacchami. And then in English, I take refuge in the Buddha, I take refuge in the Dharma, I take refuge in the Sangha. And Buddhists would often chant this at least 3 times, but sometimes many times. A lot of Buddhist activities, whether you're going to like a Sunday service in one of the temples here in Denver, or you're starting in a long, intense meditation retreat, a lot of people would begin those activities by chanting this refuge prayer. And so what are these jewels or these refuges? The first is the Buddha, where this tradition in its English term Buddhism gets its name. And basically you can think of the Buddha as the teacher, the person who taught what are seen as the fundamental truths and the path of this tradition. Literally, Buddha means an awakened one, somebody that's woken up, right? And what have they woken up to? They've woken up to seeing things as they are, seeing reality as it is. And that kind of insight allows them to overcome what Buddhists consider the ignorance that actually entraps us in this kind of suffering and discontent. So there's a real kind of knowledge aspect, or there's a special knowledge that's to be gained in Buddhism that, from the perspective of the tradition, will allow you to transcend or overcome that kind of existential problem of continuous discontent or suffering. So this is basically a title, the Buddha, somebody that's woken up. And this was first given to, this was given to a figure that lived about 2,500 years ago, who is said to have been named Siddhartha Gautama. And he was born in what's today southern Nepal, on the border between Nepal and India. Here, and in this map, you can see this country of Nepal, this small country of Nepal in the Himalayas between China and India. And right along the southern border, it said that this historical figure, Siddhartha Gautama, was born, and he eventually eventually at age around, what is it, 35, 36, is said to have sat down in meditation and discovered these kind of deeper truths of existence, which allowed him to transcend discontent and suffering. And so from then on, from about age 35 to the time he was 80, he just wandered through northern India teaching. And he gathered a community around him, a monastic community in which people took vows to live very simple lives and follow the teachings of this figure. But when he discovered these truths in meditation, then people started calling him the Buddha, this person that's woken up, right, to these deeper truths. So that's the Buddha. They say there's this historical person that actually attained this liberating insight, and then taught a whole group of followers over the course of about 45 years. And these teachings that he taught while he wandered during these last 45 years of his life became the second jewel or refuge, the Dharma. And Dharma is a term that has a lot of different meanings, but we can very simply say in this context, in a Buddhist context, it means the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama, or the teachings of the Buddha, this awakened figure. Right, so this is where the Buddha puts forth his philosophy and his path for others to follow, which will lead to this kind of liberating vision and behavior. And then the final refuge is the Sangha, the community. And this is the whole community of Buddhists who kind of support each other on the path as they follow this path that the Buddha outlined in his teachings towards this liberation from suffering in existence. And sometimes there are different ways that people use this term Sangha, the community. One is just to refer to the monastic community. Again, those people that take vows, and most of these vows are concerned with living, again, a very simple life. You kind of get rid of worldly clothes and fashion and instead just dress in robes. You shave your head. Strict monastics will not eat a meal after noon. They will not own very many personal items, just a few personal items, and the rest is kind of shared as a community among the monastics. So there's a lot of rules that they live by. But then there's a larger community. People that don't take those monastic vows, lay people in the tradition, who nonetheless follow the tradition and support the monastic community. And sometimes this is known as the fourfold Sangha, the monks and nuns and lay people, the laymen and laywomen as well. But again, kind of having trust and devotion towards these three jewels or refuges is kind of a basic thing that makes you a Buddhist. And that's agreed upon amongst almost all Buddhist traditions that you find across the world. I'm going to skip that for now. So again, the Sangha, this community, here you see some different Buddhist communities. These in the middle here, you find some young East Asian monks. On the right here, you see some Tibetan monks dressed in different colored robes, but still robes. And on the left here, you see a monastic sitting in this doorway dressed in robes. And then he's surrounded by lay people, people that have come to the temple probably on a very holy day, of kind of religious festival and holiday in the Buddhist tradition. And so they've decided to put on just white clothes, and they've taken lay vows so that for this one day, this very special holy day, they kind of enter into a very basic type of monastic life. But then after this holy day, they'll go back to their regular lives, their jobs and things. But there are times set aside for lay people even to kind of enter into this more simple, more contemplative style of life. And so you see that here. And the Buddhist tradition is very diverse. after the founder, this Siddhartha Gautama, after he died, the community continued to grow and expand. And eventually it spread out of South Asia, this kind of area of Nepal and India, and spread into first areas of Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia. And this early spread of Buddhism to these areas culminated in what's known today as Theravada Buddhism. So in Southeast Asia and in Sri Lanka, you find a style of Buddhism that's kind of very conservative. According to the tradition, they uphold a lot of the early teachings that came about during the time of the Siddhartha Gautama. And so you have Theravada Buddhism predominating in Southeast Asia. Meanwhile, Buddhism, after it spread to those areas, it continued to develop in India. And you find new forms of Buddhism emerging, especially around the beginning of the turn of the millennium, from BCE to CE. You find the development of a really new orientation towards Buddhism that became known as the Mahayana. And as that was developing in India, Buddhism began spreading to East Asia along the Silk routes, through merchants and also traveling monastics. And so this Mahayana Buddhism that developed after Buddhism spread into Southeast Asia was transmitted to East Asia. And from China, it went to Korea and then to Japan. And so you find a very different style of Buddhism predominating in East Asia than you do with Southeast Asia. And then finally, even later still in India, they developed a really very different style of Buddhism that's known as the Vajrayana. And this style of Buddhism incorporates a lot of tantric elements. And we can talk a little bit about at the end about what that means. But this started to develop maybe around the 5th century of the Common Era, CE. And that was a time when Tibet, this region of Central Asia, began to adopt Buddhism. And so you find that this Vajrayana style of Buddhism, this tantric style of Buddhism, really predominates in Tibet, and from there spread to Mongolia and other parts of Central Asia, particularly. After that, eventually Buddhism actually dies out in its homeland for the most part in India, around the 12th, 13th centuries. So you don't find much Buddhism today in India. It's really more common outside of India, again, in Southeast Asia, East Asia, and Central Asia. There is some revival of Buddhism in India today. Maybe at the end, if we want to talk about that, I can discuss some of that. But for most of the last millennium, there hasn't been much Buddhism in its homeland of India. So here you see, this is just some maps to show you how Buddhism moves out of India here, and through especially trade routes, but also political, military conquering and missionary work amongst Buddhists themselves. It spreads to Sri Lanka, and from Sri Lanka to Myanmar, and then through into Thailand and Cambodia. And so this is the kind of routes that this Theravada, this early movement of kind of conservative Buddhism, moves into Southeast Asia. And then again later, about 500 years after the Buddha lived, you find this Mahayana style of Buddhism, this really different orientation of Buddhism, start to develop. And that follows largely these overland routes, although also some sea routes into East Asia. These old silk routes, the Silk Road, right? Not just silk, but a lot of other goods, and also religion and ideas were passed along these trade routes. And so it went from Central Asia into China. But Buddhism didn't just stay in Asia. Of course, more recently, it's moved across the globe and into the United States. This is a painting by a contemporary Tibetan artist, Karma Punsok, called Liberty, and it's the Statue of Liberty spinning a prayer wheel, which is a Buddhist device, particularly used in Tibet, where you put Buddhist prayers inside the wheel and then you spin it. And just spinning the wheel is actually said to kind of release those prayers as if you were saying them with your mouth. And so here the Statue of Liberty is spinning the prayer wheel. I like that painting. So how did Buddhism enter the US? There's really two main waves in which Buddhism came into the United States. One was in the late 19th and early 20th century through immigration, particularly immigration from China and then later Japan. A lot of you maybe have heard what happened in, what was it, 1840s? Anybody know? Like then that sent actually a lot of immigrants from the eastern United States and other places off to the West Coast. And you might think of the what's
railroad?
that?
Was it the railroad?
Well, actually, the railroad came a little bit later, but that was also very important, right? So first it was the gold rush, right? There's this gold rush on the West Coast, brought a lot of people out speculating. Also brought a lot of people from East Asia, especially China. They were also interested in the gold rush. And actually in Chinese, California was known as Jinshan, which is the gold mountain. And people were kind of interested in coming and being part of that gold rush. And later on, people, especially a lot of these Chinese immigrants worked on the railroads. They were actually key. There's a great new book by Gordon Chang, what is it called? Ghosts of the Iron Road, which is all about Chinese immigrant labor on the Intercontinental Railroad. It's a really great book. I recommend reading. Really beautifully written, as well as very informative. But so a lot of people were coming for this, and of course, people were bringing their culture and their religious traditions too, and many people practice some forms of Buddhism. Then the second big wave, again, had to do with immigration, and also a counterculture movement amongst especially young Americans in the 1960s and 70s. Anybody know what happened in the mid 1960s to really affect immigration? There was a change in US law that had a huge impact on immigration. It was the Immigration Reform Act, or the Hart-Celler Act of 1965. So basically, actually, when you had this huge wave of immigration from East Asia in the 19th and 20th centuries, there was a huge backlash against that, particularly among white Americans. And a lot of it was based on kind of racist attitudes towards Asians, to where they started enacting laws that prohibited immigration from other parts of the world, and particularly Asia, culminating in the 1924 Asian Exclusion Act. And so basically, immigration from Asia was not permitted to the United States from 1924 until 1965. And it's only in 1965 that you get a real radical change in US immigration policy that again allows immigration from Asia to the United States. And so then you start to see more immigration to the United States from Asia, and again, people bringing their traditions with them, including Buddhism. And so you get Buddhist immigrants to the United States. And that's at a time, again, when especially young people in the United States who were experimenting with a lot of things that weren't part of mainstream, especially white US culture, and trying to find new ways of being, including new ways of being religious. Okay, so I'm actually going to move to the second of these first, this immigration and counterculture in the 60s and 70s, to look at the first Buddhist community that I'd like to talk about in Denver, and that's Wat Buddhawararam. So Wat Buddhawararam is a Thai Buddhist community here in Denver. It's up on the north side. It's actually in my neighborhood. My wife teaches at Regis University, so we live on the north side. And Wat Buddhawararam is just a couple blocks from Regis University on Julian Street near I-70. And it was established in 1976. It's actually one of the oldest Thai Buddhist temples in the United States. And it was where the Buddhist Monastic Council of the United States was formed that same year. So there's a lot of important history with this community for Thai Buddhism in the United States more largely. But again, why do you see this temple being founded at this time in a place like Denver? Again, it's largely because of that change in immigration law that allowed immigrants and Thai immigrants looking, especially Thai immigrants to the United States, were largely professionals looking for economic opportunity in the United States. And some of them eventually settled in Denver and started this community. Actually, they bought an old Salvation Army building on Julian Street and converted it into their temple. And so upstairs, there's this large shrine room where you see this large statue of a Buddha, the historical Buddha, at the center of the altar, and then a lot of chairs, places for the monks to sit to the side of the this worship space. And that's upstairs. And then downstairs, there's a lot of community center areas and also places for eating, usually after Sunday services where people come together with the monastics to do a lot of chanting and praying. Then people go downstairs and they have a big lunch together. So food, of course, food is a wonderful part of many cultures and many religious cultures, and that's definitely true for this community as well. There are 4 monks in residence at this wat, and actually wat is the Thai term for monastery. So in order for it to actually be a monastery, you have to have monks in residence. So there are 4 monks usually in residence here at Wat Buddhawaram, and they actually come from Thailand. They are sent by a larger Thai organization to the United States. There's not enough local monks to kind of provide the monastic community for this this wat, and so they actually get sent from Thailand, and they live here, and they usually they stay for quite a while, but some of them kind of rotate in and out. Again, their main meeting time is on Sunday mornings. They've kind of adapted to mainstream American religious weekly calendar. And so they get together on Sunday mornings. And again, the monks will lead the community in prayers and chanting, especially, the first chant that you're going to engage in will be that refuge prayer. Buddham Sharanam Gacchami, Sangam Dharmam Sharanam Gacchami, Sangam Sharanam Gacchami. And then a lot of other chants. And there will be opportunities for other practices as well. Again, is a community that's formed around a particular, it's largely a Thai American community. And one of the things they're really interested in is preserving Thai culture. And one of the ways they do that, they have a Sunday school for children, right? So children in the community come together. In addition to learning about Buddhism, they also learn about Thai language. They learn Thai culture, including dance and art and literature, right? So there's a lot of ways in which this is a place for kind of preserving and learning about cultural heritage in addition to Buddhism. And thinking about the other practices that occur at Wat Buddhawaram and actually at many other Buddhist communities here in Denver and all over the world, you can think about 2 main orientations to Buddhist practice. One is practices oriented towards making merit. And merit, what is merit? Merit is generally, you can think of it as, well, positive karma. I don't know if you may or may not be familiar with this term, karma. Okay. But karma, basically karma is an idea in Buddhism that our actions create our future circumstances. And there's a kind of ethical or moral tinge to this. So that if you engage in positive, wholesome, ethical activities, your future circumstances are going to be more positive. And if you engage in negative or unethical, harmful activities, your future circumstances are going to be less ideal. And this ties into a Buddhist idea as well of rebirth. We don't just live this lifetime but we continue to be reborn in existence in a lot of different ways. You can come back in a lot of different forms. It's not just humans, but you can come back as actually a god, a deity. You can come back as an animal. You can come back as kind of a spirit, a ghost. All these different realms in which you can be reborn. And part of what determines where you're going to be reborn and the circumstances in which you're reborn are the activities that you've engaged in this and in your past lives as well. So a lot of Buddhists especially are interested in creating good karma for themselves, creating merit. One, to ensure that they have positive circumstances in the future in this life, but also in future lives. And the more comfortable your circumstances are, probably the better your opportunities to actually practice and engage in Buddhism, right? And that'll lead you even further, not just to better rebirths, but actually to liberation from all suffering that this round of rebirths entails. But mainly, you want to engage in good activities. And what constitutes a positive karmic activity or a meritorious activity? From a Buddhist viewpoint, the basic criteria is if it benefits other people, actually other beings, even animals and all these other beings. If it benefits them, then it's a positive activity. If it harms them, then it's a negative karmic activity. And of course, you can get into a lot of discussions about the nuances of that. But that's, the basic idea is that if it's beneficial to other beings, it's positive karma. If it's harmful to other beings, it's negative karma. So people are interested in making karma to ensure that they have positive conditions in this life and in the future lives. And a lot of this goes back to your behavior, right? You want to make sure that your behavior is not harming others and instead is being beneficial for others. And then the other orientation would be meditation. And this is where you're not just kind of creating positive behaviors, but you're creating positive kind of mental attitudes, as well as that deeper insight about the nature of reality. It's said to ultimately liberate you from all suffering and dissatisfaction and discontent, right? So through meditation, you kind of train your mind to see things as they really are. A lot of Buddhists talk about this as developing wisdom. So that's kind of the other, that's the other major orientation of Buddhist practice. And these are both done in all of the communities that I'll talk about, actually. So at Wat Buddha Wararam, there's a monastic community in residence there, and the monastic community is definitely respected and valued, especially in Theravada Buddhism. There's a great respect for the monastic sangha. And so when people will come to the temple, Wat Buddha Wararam, people will often make donations to the monastic community. They'll give to the monastic community. And the monks, because of their vows, aren't able to work or engage in any kind of productive labor. So they really depend on the lay people and the generosity of the lay people to support them, to get food and clothing and shelter. And the lay people, through being generous and giving to the monastic community, they actually it's said that they create a lot of merit, a lot of good karma through their generosity. And their practice of generosity towards the monastic community hopefully develops to an extent that they just become very generous and giving overall, right? And kind of really work on that quality of being generous towards all beings. But really, for Buddhists, they say a good start is just being generous towards the monastic community. So here you see a woman coming to the temple. She's bringing bottled water, some food items, and then some other items that are necessary, kind of toiletries and other household items that the sangha will need, the monastic sangha will need. And she's offering that to the monk. And then the monk, in turn, helps her go through this ceremony that's called Trot Nam in Thai, where that merit that this layperson has gained through their generosity, they actually symbolically transfer that to other beings. And especially people will often do this with having in mind people in their family that have passed away. Right? So you might have relatives that have passed away in the recent past, you might go to the temple and give a very generous donation, and then have the monk perform this ceremony for you where there's some water vessels down below. They'll ceremoniously pour water back and forth between this vessel in order to symbolize the merit moving back and forth between the donor and these other people that are brought to mind in the prayers that are chanted. And you transfer the merit to them, saying, I don't need this merit for myself to have a better future. I want it to go to these other people so that they can have a better future. And especially people are having in mind their relatives that have passed away, trying to ensure that their next rebirth is a really positive one. And they don't end up in a rebirth that's full of suffering and a lot of difficult circumstances, but instead are born into a situation where they're going to be very comfortable, right? So there's this ceremony is a way to, again, practice generosity, but not just generosity in terms of material goods for the monks and nuns, but there's a spiritual generosity. There's thinking about the spiritual welfare, especially of your ancestors and people that have gone before and family members, or maybe it's somebody that's sick that you're really thinking about. So it's kind of, and thinking about the wider community, about your larger family connections, and really moving away towards selfishness, towards yourself, and kind of grasping, and instead having a more unselfish, selfless attitude, and an attitude of giving. Again, the monastics are often at the center of a lot of this generosity, though again, ideally it should spread to all beings. But there's a particular festival in the Theravada tradition called the Katan Festival, when after a period during the summer where the monastics are really closed off and engaged in a period of intense study and meditation, then after that kind of summer retreat period, they open the monastery back up and lay people come, and there's this big festival, and there's this outpouring of generosity towards the monastic community, usually giving them a lot of the things they'll need for the next year, and especially presenting them with new robes. And here, this is a Buddhist monastery in California that houses women monastics, Theravadan women monastics. And here you see a lay woman who's come to the monastery and is offering new robes to these women monastics. This is actually an innovation that's developed in the United States, where the monastic tradition for women actually has died out in most Southeast Asian countries. And there's not a lot of fully ordained women in Southeast Asia today. But as this tradition has come to the United States, there's been a strong interest among some women in the United States to become fully ordained monastics in this tradition. And so they've kind of revived that. And there's a strong community of Buddhist monastics, women monastics in California, and in a few other places in the United States. And so that's something, an interesting way that the tradition is developed here in the United States. Another big festival, again, festivals and holidays are important in the Buddhist tradition, like in many other traditions, is the New Year. And the New Year gets celebrated in a lot of different dates in different Buddhist cultures, but a lot of times it's in the spring. And in Thailand, they usually celebrate it in April. It's called Songkran. And it's not, an explicitly religious holiday, but a lot of people, because it's the New Year and they want to get a good start to the New Year, they'll try to create good merit and offer devotions at the local temple or monastery. So here's some people at a temple in LA, Los Angeles, United States, who have come to the temple. This is a popular activity, to bathe the Buddha. So they'll take a statue, one of the main statues in the temple, they'll bring it out to a public place, and they'll have a kind of pool of clear water, or sometimes even milk, and people will take turns kind of pouring water over and symbolically bathing the Buddha before they dress him in new clothes and offer him flowers and other things. And so you get a chance to kind make devotions and kind of publicly display your kind of trust and devotion in this figure, the Buddha, and his tradition. And again, it's seen as a way to make merit and also focus the mind on this tradition. Another practice that's quite popular in Theravada Buddhism is something called temporary ordination. This you don't find in East Asian or Central Asian Buddhist cultures, but it's quite common in Southeast Asian Theravada Buddhist cultures. And this, I forget where this is at, but this is a Buddhist community in the United States. And a lot of young Buddhists, usually around between the ages of kind of 16 through early 20s, will take a summer or maybe a year, like a gap year between high school and college, and they'll become fully ordained monks, but just temporarily for those few months or that year. And they'll use that time to live a monastic lifestyle and engage in really deep study of the tradition, right? It's often seen as a rite of passage for young men, especially, to become kind of adult members, learned members of the Buddhist community. Right, so there's an aspect of that kind of meditation and developing wisdom. You're studying and engaging in meditation and developing that aspect of the tradition in a really intensive way through this period. But again, there's also that idea that you're creating merit. And a lot of people will do this, especially to create merit for their parents. You know, when a parent gives a son or a daughter to become a monastic, the parent actually is said to earn tremendous amounts of merit. And so if a young person chooses to do that, it's seen as a very respectful action towards their parents and a real good next life insurance policy, you could say. And so then afterwards, they'll return to lay life and they'll take up their studies or they'll enter a job, but they have that kind of a really deep immersion in their tradition for this period of time. Again, meditation is practiced in these traditions. A lot of people, actually, a place like Wat Buddhawararam, some people will not practice meditation at all. And some people will kind of dabble in it. And then a few people will really engage in it intensively. And so it's not, it's not a really common practice, but it's seen as very important. And it's become more popular as time has gone on. And here's some young people, again, during their Sunday school, learning some basic types of meditation from the monastics in that community. Actually, I'm not going to get into too much more of meditation. Maybe we can talk about that afterwards. Okay, so now I'd like to turn to a very different Buddhist community here in Denver, the Denver Buddhist Temple. Sometimes it's called the Tri-State Buddhist Temple. It's actually right downtown on Lawrence Street. And it comes out of a Japanese tradition of Pure Land Buddhism. So Japan, if you recall from my remarks at the beginning, there's a really different orientation than this Theravada style that I was just talking about. Instead, in Japan, they consider themselves Mahayana Buddhists. And one of the styles of Mahayana Buddhism is this Pure Land Buddhism that's practiced at this temple. So if you see, it was established in 1916. So this community is over 100 years old. And again, this goes back to that early wave of Japanese immigration to the United States. Japanese immigrants began arriving in the 1870s. A lot of them came to work in the agricultural sector, but eventually a lot of people settled in urban areas and opened businesses. This is a Japanese laundry, I think from the 1890s or early 20th century. And again, as they came to this country, a lot of people looking for economic opportunity, they brought with them their religious traditions. And especially a lot of Japanese immigrants that came to the United States came out of this Pure Land Buddhist tradition. And in 1899, the first two Japanese missionaries from this tradition came. Actually, they were requested to come by local Japanese communities in the United States. They had sent a request to the headquarters in Japan, hey, can you send us some priests to kind of lead our community? And so these two Japanese Pure Land priests came to the United States and established Pure Land Buddhism, Japanese Pure Land Buddhism here in the United States. This was Shuye Sonada and Kokurio Nishijima. Again, they came in 1899, and they founded what was originally known as the Buddhist Mission to North America. But during World War II, that organization changed its names to the Buddhist Churches of America, the BCA, as it's the abbreviation is commonly known by. So, why would they change their name from the Buddhist Mission of North America to the Buddhist Churches of America? A lot of that has to do with, again, kind of intolerance towards Asians in the United States, and especially during World War II. Right, in World War II, a lot of Japanese Americans, including Buddhists, who are often the first to be targeted, were sent to relocation camps. They were sent from the West Coast to these war relocation centers in the interior. One of them was actually in Colorado, Camp Amache. And this is actually being turned into a historical site. There's been a lot of historical study and actually archaeology. Some of that's been done at the University of Denver to kind of reclaim this site as an important historical site. But a lot of people were transferred to these, almost all Japanese Americans on the West Coast were transferred to these centers. They weren't allowed to leave. They were put into these barracks. But nonetheless, they carried on life as much as they could, including religious life. And these Buddhist communities were reestablished in the camps. But it was at this time they decided to rename themselves the Buddhist Churches of America, again, to sound kind of less Japanese, less foreign, less like the enemy that they were being targeted as. And actually, Ralph Carr, who was the governor of Colorado at the time, he was vocally against this idea of interning Japanese Americans. He said, they are loyal Americans. They're just like everybody else. We have no reason to round them up and curtail their civil rights. And a lot of people said he was actually on his way to becoming a possible presidential candidate. But because of this strong stance that he took against Japanese internment, his political career basically ended. It wasn't a popular stance at the time. But he believed in that. And he actually welcomed Japanese to come freely to California and set up, kind of reestablish their lives as free citizens in the state of Colorado. And for those actions, if you actually, right next to the Denver Buddhist Temple on Lawrence Street, there's a monument to Ralph Carr, kind of a recognition by the Japanese American community in Denver of Ralph Carr's stance during that time. But so from that time, you get even more Japanese Americans settling here in Colorado. And so the temple continues to expand. But because it's a Pure Land Buddhist temple, one of their main practices is, again, chanting. And here they chant to a particular Buddha called Amida Buddha. And they use this phrase, Namo Amida Butsu, which means homage to Amida Buddha. So in Mahayana Buddhism, this kind of later development of Buddhism that you find in East Asia, there's an idea that there's not just one Buddha that lived 2,500 years ago, but there's all kinds of Buddhas throughout the universe and actually multiverses. And if you call on them, they'll actually help you on the Buddhist path because of their great compassion. So in this tradition, they focus particularly on a Buddha that lives far in a kind of galaxy or universe far to the west, called Sukhavati. Amida Buddha lives there in the universe, in the world system that Amida Buddha lives in, is kind of this beautiful place where everything is oriented towards Buddhism. Basically, it's very easy to practice Buddhism because even like the birds in the trees, when they sing, you just hear, Buddhist teachings. And everything is really great. And so people recite this homage to Amida Buddha in the belief that he will actually bring them to his Pure Land after they die, so that they can really practice Buddhism in this Pure Land and attain awakening there. There's an idea that in this life, in this society, in these times, it's actually very hard to practice Buddhism. And so it's good to rely on Amida Buddha and go to his Pure Land after you die, where it'll be very easy. Probably because of Facebook and the internet and all of this, everything is very distracting. It's hard to stay focused on your religious practice. And so if you go to this other place, you can really engage in Buddhist practice. Now, some Pure Land Buddhists will say, actually, the Pure Land, although it's talked about in the scriptures as being far away, it's actually right here, right now. And it just represents a state of mind. And if you recite the Nembutsu enough, it habituates you to looking at your present reality as a Pure Land. And it slowly transforms your reality into that Pure Land. And you kind of reach a state of awakening right here in this world. So there's different ways to actually to understand this concept of the Pure Land as well. Okay, finally, I want to leave time for questions, but I did have one more location, so I'll try to move through that really quickly. We've talked about immigration and kind of Asian American Buddhist communities, which are the majority of Buddhist communities in the United States. Probably around 2/3 of the Buddhist communities in the United States are Asian American heritage Buddhist communities. But there's also a significant interest in Buddhism among non-Asian Americans. And sometimes these are called convert Buddhist communities. Predominantly white Americans, but also increasingly African American, Latino, Latinx, and Native American. Americans are all, there's interest among all these different groups. But a lot of these convert communities historically are predominantly white. People like, here you see Chogyam Trungpa, who was a very famous Tibetan Buddhist teacher, who eventually settled in Boulder, Colorado, and started the Boulder Shambhala Center, which is on Spruce Street up in Boulder. But here you see him, one of his famous students was Allen Ginsberg, the poet, who often kept a little notepad in his pocket when he was sitting in meditation with Chogyam Trungpa, and then he'd have a good idea and he'd hop up and he'd have to write down a new poem. So here's the Shambhala Center up in Boulder. There's a beautiful shrine room on the top floor there. But here in a lot of these convert communities, there's less emphasis on this kind of merit making and more focus on meditation. Right, so this is the Shambhala Meditation Center in Denver, which is on Syracuse Street in the southeast part of town. And so if you go to these communities, what you're going to see a lot of people doing is engaging in meditation, right? There's a strong inclination to say at these centers, what's at the heart of the tradition? What should every Buddhist be doing? They should be meditating. That's kind of at the core of what a lot of these more convert-oriented Buddhist communities are interested in. But again, that's not to say that they leave behind some of these other practices. A lot of times before engaging in this group meditation, they'll recite prayers. And again, just like we saw at the beginning, refuge is a big part of that. So here's a Tibetan prayer that people might say before engaging in a kind of group meditation. Sangye chutang chuki tsognam la jangju pardu dagni gyapsuchi laki jinso ki peson namgi jola penchir sangye ju parsho. And so that starts with a kind of refuge prayer. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, or the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain awakening. And then there's this kind of orientation towards merit, but merit generated again in generosity towards others. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so forth, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. So through the merit I attain from my good actions, whether it's meditation or generosity or some other quality, may I attain awakening in order that I can help other beings, not for myself, and moving away from selfishness towards selflessness. And one practice that you find common in East Asia and Tibet is this kind of ransoming of animals to practice compassion. And some of these kind of ceremonious activities have also come to North America. This is a Tibetan Buddhist monastery in Canada, in Nova Scotia, that's related to Chogyam Trungpa and his founding of Shambhala in Boulder. But every year they actually raise money and they buy a whole catch of lobsters, and they pay a fisherman to go out with his whole catch of lobsters and throw them back out into the ocean. So then instead of being boiled in a pot, they get to live out their lives, at least until they get caught again the next year, I guess. But there's this idea that you should practice generosity. You should also practice compassion and benefiting other beings, including lobsters and crustaceans and things like that. So a lot of these practices are also moving into North America. Okay, but I'll stop there. I realize we're almost out of time, but I'm happy to stay a little longer and entertain any questions or just talk more generally.
Thank you, Ben, so very much. This was a wonderful, quick, I know there's so much more you can talk about probably.